Welcome back to part 2 of making a vintage dress from 1959. If you missed part 1, in which I made the bodice of the dress, I will add a link on the screen now for you to go and watch that video, as this video will focus on the making of the skirt. Now, this pattern didn't include pockets, so of course I had to improvise some myself. I used a pattern piece for inseam pockets from a different pattern and attached the pockets to the centre of each skirt panel. I used the markings for the centre front skirt opening as a guide. I stitched the pocket pieces on with right sides together and with the bulk of the pocket facing away from the opening. I creased back the seam allowances with my fingers and then cut the skirt panel open between the stitching lines, getting as close to the point at the bottom as I could. I then pulled the pocket sections through to the wrong side to check the stitching. I hadn't quite cut far enough and the bottom of the pocket wasn't lying flat, so I went back and snipped a bit further, which seemed to do the trick. I then joined the two halves of the pocket back with a French seam. To do this, I pulled the pocket sections back to the right side and then pinned them wrong sides together before machining around the edge with a narrow seam allowance. I then notch all the way around the curved edges of the pocket. I then turn the pocket wrong side out and push it back around the wrong side of the skirt, and crease the seam open with my fingers. I roll the seam allowances so that the seam line is right on the edge and pin in place. Then the pockets are stitched again, this time with right sides together. I took the skirt panels to the ironing board to give them a good press and realised I had left these raw edges that still needed neatening. I wasn't sure of the best way to do that, so I carried on with the rest of the skirt so that I could mull it over as I sewed. I made some more bias binding to neaten the skirt placket opening and then returned to the pattern instructions for how to sew it. I reinforced my sewing line with a line of machine stitching before cutting the slit open. I then pinned on the bias binding, matching the folded edge to the line of stitching I just did. It was quite tricky to manoeuvre the binding around the acute angle of the V-shaped opening. I ended up opening out the V to try and get it to work and added some extra ease in the binding at that point. I then carefully machined the facing in place, before folding the binding around to the wrong side of the skirt and hand stitching it in place with a felling stitch. I had to put a few tucks in the binding at the point of the V to get it to lie flat, but I'm okay with that. I keep adjusting the binding as I stitch to keep everything nice and neat. I then joined the long skirt seams with a French seam. With hindsight, I wish I had done French seams on the bodice as well, as you shall see later. I stitched the skirt panels with wrong sides together, pressed the seams, before trimming down the seam allowance. I then turned the panels around to be right sides together and pressed the seam allowance from the wrong side. I then did the second line of stitching. Only I didn't trim the seam allowance down enough, so I had to unpick it, trim some more off, and then stitch it again. With the panels joined together, I started on the hem. This meant I had to partly undo the French seam I had just sewn to reduce the bulk in the hem fold. I found a Stanley knife the best way to do this. Once partly undone, I could iron the seam open below the hemfold. I then turned under the bottom edge of the skirt by 2 centimeters and pressed in place. I then realised that I needed to undo even more of the seam allowance, so I got my knife back out for more unpicking and pressed the rest of the seam open. I could then measure the skirt to check it was the correct length and pinned and pressed it in place. I then made a decision on how to neaten the raw edges of my pocket and turned them under, ready to be filed in place by hand. I've been trying to incorporate more couture techniques into my sewing after reading Claire Schaefer's book, so I chose to finish as many seams as possible by hand. I felled the edges of the pockets in place and used a slip stitch to sew the hem of the skirt. As this is such a deep hem, the slip stitch will help to stop the weight of the fabric pulling the hem down. With the skirt hem in place, it was time to pin in all those pleats. I got the pattern piece back out so that I could follow the direction of the arrows and matched up all those balance marks I had tacked in earlier. This cotton pleated up really nicely. I had a little bit of a job getting the centre front placket to lie correctly with the pleats, as I had to get my dyslexic head around left and right and which way the buttons go and all that stuff. Eventually I got there and then tacked all those pleats in place. I then could join the skirt to the bodice of the dress. I did this by matching up the centre fronts and centre backs. Due to this being a 3-panel skirt, the side seams didn't match, so I had to eyeball it slightly. I then machined the two together with the skirt section on top so that I could be sure all those pleats were going to lie nice and flat. When I got to the pockets, I stopped sewing and restarted on the other side of the pocket to avoid sewing the pocket down in one direction. Once joined together, I tried the dress on, only to discover it was too long in the torso. I didn't take my usual 3 centimeters out of the waist length on this pattern, as I had thought that I wouldn't need to because it was a missus pattern, but it was still too long by about 1.5 centimeters. So I unpicked the waist seam and moved up the waist pleats by 1.5 centimeters. Pinning and sewing them in place as before. I then trimmed off 1.5 centimeters using the previous sewing line as a guide. Then I reattached the skirt and bodice, which gave a much better fit. It was then time to move on to all the finishing touches. I used the pattern piece to mark the placement for the buttonholes. I had to adjust this slightly due to my newly shortened bodice. I then checked my machine's manual for the required buttonhole settings. I don't have an automatic buttonhole foot, so I had to do them manually. I threaded the bobbin through the hole in the arm of the case to create greater tension on the bobbin thread. I then set about making a sample. It's really important to make sure you do a sample through the same layers of fabric as the original to check the tension will be okay. For me, this was 2 layers of cotton and a layer of interfacing. I then measured my buttons and chalked on some guidelines for the buttonhole. Remember to extend the end of the buttonhole a few millimeters past the centre front line so that the 2 edges will meet perfectly. I changed to my manual buttonhole foot and started sewing. I won't go into too much specific detail about buttonholes as every machine is different. Just make sure to make as many samples as necessary until you are happy. Mine turned out pretty perfect on the first try. So I marked up my fronts with chalk and started sewing. Before cutting my buttonholes open, I used a little fray check on them to stop them going too ragged once cut. It was then time to make a belt. I have quite a collection of vintage haberdashery, so I raided my drawers for a 1950s style belt buckle. I selected a few from my collection that I thought might work and tried them out against the fabric of the belt. I quickly eliminated several that weren't right and then put the remaining few to a poll on Instagram. This circular blue one won, so I started to make the belt to the correct size. I machine tacked a strip of interfacing to one half of the belt. Then joined the 2 halves together with right sides together, leaving the short edge open. I then trimmed down the excess seam allowance and graded the point before turning the tube of fabric right side out. I rolled the edges of the seam between my fingers to get a crisp point, before installing the buckle by threading the end through the centre of the buckle, turning the raw edges under and pinning in place. I then retired to the garden to enjoy the last of the evening sunlight and began on all the hand finishing I had to do. Firstly, I slip stitched the edge of the belt in place. Then, once the fray check had dried, I cut open the buttonholes. Next, I decided to remove all the hand basting and tailor's tacks. This always takes much longer than expected. I left the marks for the centre fronts in so that I could properly set the buttons. I do this one at a time by matching the centre fronts and the waistline, inserting a pin through the buttonhole and then using this pin as a marker for where the button needs to go. I use a doubled thread to sew on the button through all the layers of fabric. And keep a pin between the fabric and the button so that I don't sew the button on too tightly. I then remove the pin and create a little thread shank by wrapping the thread around and around the stitching. I then secure the wraps in place by pulling the thread through the middle before finishing off my thread on the wrong side. You know how I said I wish I had done French seams on the bodice? Yeah, that's because I ended up having to hand overcast all the raw edges on the bodice seams. I am glad that I took the time to do another couture technique on this dress, but I can't help but feel that French seams just look neater. Next came a skirt hook and bar at the waistband. I had hoped to finish the dress that evening, but the light quickly faded and I decided that the last few touches could wait until the morning. Then I added some poppers to the skirt opening. I have a variety of vintage styles and sizes in my collection, but I went for the slightly larger 00 size. In my experience, vintage poppers are of such a superior quality to modern ones, which have rough edges and wear through the threads after a couple of wears, that I only use vintage ones these days. There is a lot of debate about which way is the right way around to sew on snap fasteners, but I usually alternate mine, which makes it a lot harder to do them up wrong. I also rotate one half slightly so that the stitching holes are offset, like this. This helps to redistribute the strain on the fabric more evenly and prevent holes. The final piece of hand finishing was to create a little thread loop to act as a belt carrier. This is essentially a crochet chain, but if you aren't familiar with crochet, you make a loop out of thread and then pull the tail of the thread through that loop to create another loop, and so on until your chain is the desired length. Then, pass the needle through the final loop and sew the chain in place. Make sure it's not too tight, otherwise you won't be able to fit the belt through. And then the dress was complete. Time to get dressed. As this dress was white, it was a bit see-through, and so I wore my 1950s slip underneath it. The fabric, the buttons, the buckle, and the poppers are all vintage, something I'm really pleased I was able to achieve. The only new elements are the thread, the interfacing, and the skirt hook. All in all, I think it turned out pretty great. I think that it has a really authentic 1950s feel thanks to the vintage fabric, and I'm really pleased that I took the time to go for a really high level of finish. There are some things that aren't so great, like the fact I put the pockets in the wrong place, so they've ended up too far around to the back. The belt also doesn't want to stay cinched, so I think it needs a hook added. But it definitely passes the swoosh test, so really, what more do you need? Thanks for watching, see you next time.